Awesome. Well, it is my great pleasure today to get to introduce Dr. David Vance. He's been here before. This isn't his first rodeo here, but we're bringing him back because he's always doing amazing work in the field of HIV. For those of you who don't know him, he's a university professor at the University of Alabama School of Nursing, and he's a psychologist whose career has really been dedicated to understanding and supporting cognitive health across adulthood, especially for those living and aging with HIV. His research spans cognitive aging, cognitive remediation, cognitive training, social cognition he's gotten into, and cognitive intra-individual variability, which we're going to hear about today. He's gotten into olfaction and more recently cognition in cancer survivors. And he's really guided by this deep commitment to promoting successful cognitive aging, as well as nurturing the next generation of scientific leaders. I mean, he's mentored over 50 PhD students. He's contributed, I don't know, hundreds of papers. He's been honored by the White House Forum on Aging and HIV. I mean, his accolades go on and on. He's my partner in crime in the Max Wise combined cohort study, running the neuropsychology, or I like to call it the brain health working group, because it kind of encompasses all of it. So he's really a leader in our field, and I'm super excited to have him talk today. So I'm going to hand the baton over to you, David Vance.
Okay, great. So it is my pleasure to be here and share with you some of one of my projects that I'm working on. And I actually was analyzing the data this morning for this talk because, well, you get busy and there's nothing like a talk to really motivate you. So this is for my R21 study. Does executive functioning training improve cognitive inconsistency and dispersion in middle-aged and older adults with HIV? So, and if you don't know what those terms are, I'm going to go over them. All right. We'll see if I can move forward. There we go. So I don't have any disclosures except for I do receive funding from NIH. So I approach things as a gerontologist. That's where I come from. And so as a gerontologist and as someone aging with HIV, I'm really concerned about how people are going to age with HIV. It's very personal for me. And we know that 70% of people living with HIV will be 50 and over by 2030. So that's a lot of us. And we know that multimorbidity is going to be a big issue with that. And of course, these comorbidities or multimorbidities are going to impact brain health and cognition. So we're really concerned about that. So, and I think everyone here can knows that there are so many risk factors in the HIV literature for brain health, and these, it's stress, age, income, insulin resistance, hepatitis. One thing I focus quite a bit on is cognitive activity, obviously substance use, and so forth and so on. And so I really focus on interventions a lot, and that's probably due to some of my being mentored from for years ago with a T32 working on cognitive training interventions. But we already know that there's a lot of things that impact brain health. And so I have sort of the positive neuroplasticity elements down at the bottom: poor health, poor sleep hygiene, poor nutrition, and so forth. And then we have the things that we know are good for brain health, such as physical activity, social interaction, intellectual pursuits, and cognitive remediation. And that's where I really have spent a lot of time over the decades at now looking at cognitive training programs. And I started this when I wasn't even working in HIV. I was working in just older adults. And there's a lot of studies out there that have looked at cognitive training and brain training, computerized programs for older adults. And a lot of them show that they are very effective in improving cognition, but it's usually in certain areas and domains. So I'm not a fan of people saying that cognitive training improves all of cognition. I don't think that's accurate. That's my opinion. But we do know that some of these cognitive training programs do have can have a robust effect size for improving certain domains. And so this is from just one study by Lampert and colleagues that shows the effect sizes of gains in certain cognitive domains. One that we focus quite a bit on is speed of processing. But I'm going to be talking a little bit more about executive functioning today. So I've been working in this lane for quite some time, but then during COVID, I had time to look at other literature. I stumbled onto this concept of cognitive inter-individual variability. And I was like, well, what is this? And I knew very little about it. It's actually been around for a long time, but I think it has come to a resurgence where people are developing a lot of interest in it. And in fact, I got this book that I've read a couple of times now to really get my head around it. So we measure a lot of things by taking tallies or taking a mean score for something, such as a reaction time test. We might, at that point, take the average of the reaction time, and that's the score. And that's a very legitimate way of measuring certain behaviors or phenomena. And so that's great. But what IIV measurements do, or cognitive inter-individual variability does, is it measures how much of the variability one is exhibiting in their behavior or their function, in this case, cognition. And there's studies that suggest that looking at that variability and not the mean of the performance is equally important as well. So, and there's two ways that we can measure that. We measure it through a concept called inconsistency and another concept called dispersion. So, and before we get into the weeds, I just want to mention that inter-individual, I'm going to call it IIV because I get tongue-tied. IIV is an approach. It's amongst many. It's about studying dynamic fluctuations in function. So do we consider maladaptive or adaptive? Well, it depends. It depends on what's being studied. We know that cognitive IIV is greater in younger adults, and then it gets younger ages, and then it gets smaller when people become adults, and then we see it actually get bigger again as people are aging. So, it has some developmental periods associated with it. And we also know that it really depends on what you're studying. So, blood oxygen level, low IIV is actually bad. We want more variability in this case because less bold oxygen level flow is associated with more poor cognition. So what do we mean by dispersion and what do we mean by inconsistency? So by dispersion, we're referring to the variability in performance across a cognitive battery. And there's actually there's several formulas. There's actually 4 formulas. These are the 2 more popular ones that are used to calculate that. It's the inter-individual variability standard deviation and the coefficient of variation. And I have those formulas at the end of the slides, and I'm happy to provide these slides if you want them. Then we refer to inconsistency, and this refers to variability related to a single person's performance task within the same task. So dispersions across domains, across tests, inconsistencies within the same test. And so that's what we mean by inconsistency and dispersion. I'll go through an example of that. And one of the common tests that we use to measure this is the Conners Continuous Performance Test. And I'm going to share with you some of the results from that today. One thing that's very interesting as I've been looking at the literature is that there are very few studies that look at both dispersion and inconsistency in the same study in the same population. And so we assume that they are measuring the same idea of IIV, but sometimes the literature isn't very clear about that. So that's one of the keys of the study I'm going to be describing is that we're going to have both measures. So here's what we mean by dispersion. Let's say that you have Tom, Dick, and Harry. We gave them cognitive battery, where they were examined on executive functioning, attention, speed of processing, verbal learning, verbal memory, spatial learning, and spatial memory. And let's say we got their T-scores, we averaged it, and we have their global mean score. So for all of them, we could see that for Tom, Dick, and Harry, their mean score is 39. So if we just looked at their mean score, we'd say, hey, they're all functioning the same. But are they? So when we look at actually where they fell out on their T-score for each of these, we see that Tom has very low variability. Dick has a little bit more variability, and Harry has a lot of variability. So what we know from cognitive IIV is that the higher the variability, even though if people may be doing well on average, that's an indicator that there might be some problems that will surface later on. And so we can also see that in inconsistency as well. So with such as a reaction time test, let's say someone got 7 trials of reaction time. Their mean reaction time is 1.4, which is actually not a good reaction time. But if we say that Tom, Dick, and Harry had a reaction time of 1.4, we would say that they have the same reaction time, which is sort of true, but not really. Especially when we look at their variability. And again, like the previous example, we can see that Tom has low variability, Dick has medium, and Harry has a lot of variability. So we can look at the mean scores and make some inferences, but we also need to consider the variability that is involved with all of this. And so I went into the cognitive aging literature, and there's a lot of studies out there in the cognitive aging literature that suggests that increased cognitive IIV predicts cognitive decline and even mortality. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but across a lot of these studies, we see that it predicts cognitive impairment 5 years later, dementia 3 years later, and poor white matter integrity. So, and this was all, so we had some time during COVID, so we wrote a lot of papers, did a lot of systematic reviews, and one of them was on the cognitive IIV. And I was like, well, what is being used in the HIV literature? So we did one of these systematic reviews. We found that there were 13 studies on this in HIV using cognitive IIV in some form or fashion. And what we found, to summarize these 13 articles, was that that cognitive IIV was able to detect subtle cognitive impairments that are not captured by traditional mean-based neuropsychological tests. And it was associated with poor cognitive performance and cognitive decline, cortical atrophy, poor everyday functioning, specifically medication adherence, and even mortality. And so and one of the theories that are floating around is, why is this happening? And it's like, well, one of the theories is perhaps it's due to this executive dyscontrol hypothesis, which suggests that if executive control is lost, then there's a lot more variability in coordinating all these other cognitive abilities. It sounds like a reasonable explanation. So that's something that we'll consider. So as I've been playing with this concept of cognitive IIV, I found that, we have some data sets just available. I have some, and there's some in the MaxWise. And so these data sets lend themselves well to exploring whether cognitive IIV is of interest. So here's just a few of those studies. I'm going to go over the one on the bottom on social determinants of health. And so this was a separate R21 that we did a few years ago, where we were looking at individualized training. So participants would come in, we would give them the cognitive battery to see if they had hand or not. And so we were looking for their if they had a more than a standard deviation away from their normative mean on speed of processing, verbal learning memory, spatial memory, delayed verbal learning, attention, executive functioning, and so forth. And so the whole idea of this training study was to see, okay, where are the deficits for this particular person, and then we would assign them two domains to improve their functioning. So everyone, in a sense, got a different training. Some people got speed of processing and executive functioning. Some people got attention and spatial memory training. So there was a lot of different interventions. But everyone got 20 hours of intervention, 10 hours in each of the domains in which we targeted. So, so I'm going to go over just a little bit of the intervention data, but for the most part, this will be the baseline data where we have people with and without hand. And so what we found, it was that cognitive IIV is greater in hand. That's what we would sort of expect. We also found that there was it was greater in blacks with hand, but the effect was attenuated when we looked at education. This didn't make it into the paper because, well, for a lot of reasons, but we just decided to drop it from the paper to get the paper published. But what we also found was that when we looked at cognitive IIV, according to training, whether people got the training or not, it really didn't make, we weren't able to train cognitive IIV away. But then again, this study was not designed to train away cognitive IIV. And so we had another study that we did that was finished a few years, 5 years ago, where we were doing cognitive training with speed of processing. So people either got 10 hours of speed of processing, 20 hours of speed of processing, or a sham intervention group, and they got 10 hours of that. So, and people came to our center, we administered this intervention. We had a lot of people, 216 were randomized. And so we already analyzed the data, completed the study aims. We're like, hey, maybe cognitive IIV has an effect here. Perhaps we can look at it in this regard. And so we did. So we generated a dispersion measure from our neurocognitive battery. And we wanted to see whether cognitive IIV could be used as an outcome variable or as a moderator variable. And what we found was that the speed of processing training did not have an impact on cognitive IIV across the 2 years. What we did find was that cognitive IIV may be a moderator of the cognitive training, though. So that was sort of interesting and new for us as well. So going back to this executive dysfunction hypothesis, we started thinking, well, perhaps if we can, since is this deficit with executive functioning, and we see that in a lot of people with HIV, maybe we can train to that and improve cognitive IIV. And so we wrote our protocol paper, we got the grant when the grant got funded, so this is it, executive functioning training for specifically reducing cognitive IIV. So this was a small randomized controlled trial. So this is how the study looks. Our first aim was just feasibility. So I'll be reporting on the acceptability and the attrition and things like that separately, not in this presentation. What I was more interested in, at least from a neuropsychological point of view, is does this intervention have any impact in improving executive functioning? Does it improve the prevalence of hand? We've sort of deleted that. We decided not to do hand after all with the permission of NIH. And we also want to see if it will reduce cognitive IIV, both a measure of dispersion and inconsistency. So we recruited people from our clinic here at UAB. We call it the 1917 clinic because no one wants to go to an HIV/AIDS clinic. So we recruited from there. Our target was 120. We got 119, so we feel pretty good about that. And people were randomized to receive either 20 hours of the training or they were in a no contact control group. And then they came back for their post-test. And the target was 12 weeks. It was not 12 weeks. Many times it was hard. Sometimes people disappeared and then resurfaced. So the post-test, I'm not done analyzing the data. We have to control for that amount of time. Here's what the training looked like. We used some training that we used in our prior R21 for executive functioning training. These are exercises that are available online where participants came in, they engaged in this. We helped them get on the computer and monitored them. And so all of these different exercises rotated, so everyone got the same rotation. And all of these tests required task shifting. Some were very similar to the MBAC paradigm. And some were very similar to a Stroop test. So it was a very executive functioning heavy. This is actually straight from the grant, where we were saying we'll use the Brace Plus. And so from that, we already have our executive functioning measures and our domain measures. And we were also going to do the IIV inconsistency with the Conners continuous performance test. And so we would have both inconsistency and dispersion. So the good thing about the Conners continuous performance test is it provides a lot of different output. But two of the measures are really related to this concept of inconsistency. So, and that's really what I'm focusing on in those. But the other measures are of interest, but we're really focused on these two measures of inconsistency. And then we're also using the Brace. And so that's what the Brace looks like. I think a lot of people already here already know a lot about the Brace, but it was such a time saver and such a help because we could just get people started. And they basically it was administered, it was self-administered, which was fantastic. All right, so we did a brief case comparison study. So the first two people who completed all 20 hours of training, we grabbed their data and then found two comparable, demographically comparable participants in the no contact control group and just looked at the changes and it's more as a descriptive and to characterize the study. So in this paper, our statistician did a point comparison between these cases and looking at the Conners continuous performance test, specifically the HIT standard deviation and the variability. Those are our two inconsistency measures. And we did find that, at least with the cases, it seemed like we can't say significant because it's a case comparison, but there was a trend for this intervention was improving inconsistency. So we're excited about that. So now I'm going to, and I really was just analyzing the data this morning for the first time, at least this thoroughly. I've done some preliminary before, but this time I really got to dive in. And so we had 59 in the control group, 60 in the intervention group. They were very similar in terms of age, around 54, 53. Gender was very similar. I would have to say, though, this is the first study I've had where we've had more women than men. That's very unusual for my studies. So that was unique. Most of the sample was African American. Most had high school or a little bit beyond in terms of their education. Depression was not clinically high, but moderate. It was getting there. In terms of training, the average time in which they engaged in 20 for the intervention group was around 9 hours. The goal was 20. So some people didn't do any, and many completed all of the training. Also, the RAT was administered, and we see that the intervention group actually did a little bit better on the RAT. So we were interested again, just looking at pre-post comparisons, specifically looking at the hit reaction time, standard deviation, and the variability. So just looking at the baseline comparison between the two groups on these measures of the Conners continuous performance test, they were all very similar except for the variability. It just so happened that the executive functioning group actually did better. lower is better. So they did better at baseline than the control group. That's not what I wanted, but that's just what we found. Then when I was looking at, and this is an intent to treat analysis, so the only thing we're controlling for here is their baseline performance on these tests. So looking at these ANCOVAs, what we see is that there was no change due to the intervention except for variability. And in this case, it looks like the intervention group, when looking at the means, the intervention group performed better. So the intervention, we can hopefully assume, reduce their cognitive IIB. It's also worth pointing out that we lost 8 in the control group and 13 in the intervention group, which I don't consider that bad. So now I went ahead and looked at the dosage. So so controlling for the number of hours that people received, I thought that would boost the effect. It did not. So I'm a little disappointed there. So I'm scratching my head. I don't know what to do with that yet. So I will be looking at that a little bit further. But I went ahead and did some correlations of the change in the score of each of these measures in the Conners Continuous Performance Test, and then looked at the hours of training just for the intervention group. And what I did find was that, and this is in the expected direction, that those who engaged in more hours of the training improved on the hit rate score and the hit rate score standard deviation, but not on our measure of variability. So one of the measures turned out being significant, so that's somewhat encouraging. So there's more to explore. So at this point, the takeaway is it's inconclusive at the moment. We sort of found a little bit of evidence to support the executive discontrol hypothesis. But we're still in data analysis, and we got the BRACE data last week, and so thank you, Raha, for that. We are going to be analyzing those data soon while we're putting it together. And so we need to control for the amount of training, and so we'll be looking at the intent to treat versus the dosage response. So right now, things are inconclusive, but that's where we are. And of course, none of this work is done in isolation. It's all team science. So thank you, everyone, for your help, and thank you, NIH, for the support. So at this point, I open up for questions.
So first of all, David, thank you. And I'm going to take, as you were just given the BRACE data from Raha, and then I'll get to Jules in a second. But the one thing that we can take a look at that Raha, I don't know if David has, but we have like kind of trial by trial data coming from like the Stroop and things of that nature. And
Which
so we
taps into that IIV measure. So we've been talking about and figuring out how to turn that into a quantitative outcome as well. The trails won't have it necessarily, but the other tests will.
Yeah, so some of the tests you can get the trial by trial and take a look. Maybe it might be a little bit more sensitive. So that's just a point.
But for the response times, I've already sent you the standard deviation within each test. So you do have that within test.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of data. You said
I know. It's so much data. And now we're going to create.
Yeah, which one am I focusing on here? Yeah.
Jules.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, for the presentation. Very interesting. I have a comment and a question. So outside of this group and folks like in this group, the issue of cognitive impairment and functioning in older people with HIV is completely underestimated and misunderstood by clinicians, by patients, by the healthcare infrastructure, by the federal and state governments. It's just completely overlooked. And the future for these folks is just being ignored since it gets very little attention, including in the ACTG. despite that they have a neuroscience committee. But my question is, I've heard this, and I'd like to know your opinion. I've heard that cognitive training is not effective, or it's questionable because people who do the training figure out how it works and they pick the results just based on figuring out what the test is looking for. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so some of these tests are, well, you're training to a task in many of these tests, in these training approaches. So you're almost like practicing the neuropsychological test. So that comes under scrutiny, and I get the point of that. Um, but in terms of people anticipating, that's part of the learning too. So that's some of what we're trying to get people to do is to think so that they can anticipate. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But having done these tests, they're still random, whatever the task is. And so you're still having to respond as if it's new. So it's a new trial each time. So it's still exercising the brain, or at least your attention, or whatever the cognitive ability is being trained to.
Right,
But
right. But the evidence of its effectiveness seems to be in question, including from your study, right?
yeah, so this one's still uh, in uh, in development. Yeah, so sometimes what we're hoping for is that there's transfer effect. So, for example, some of our, and this is more in the aging literature, and folks without HIV, but we've done a lot of the speed of processing training for a specific reason. And that was because I used to do some driving research too. And of course, if we can open up one's useful field of view, we know that can make them a safer driver. And that's what a lot of the speed of processing training does. Uh, we hope it has other benefits too, but that was the main thing is we want to create safer drivers. So that's part of why some of this training has to be very specific to how you want to translate it into everyday function and everyday world. So not all training is the same, and I tout that all the time because I want people to be very clear that this just doing a training program is not going to make your life infinitely better. It might make things better in this regard or on this task, but it's got to be but it's not a panacea.
So basically, what you're saying is it depends on the type of cognitive training you're doing, and then you have to have some sort of limits on how much you expect to benefit from it. It might have some benefit, but don't expect too much. That's sort of what you're saying, right?
Right, for that specific, yeah, for a specific domain. So what I would like to see is if people like a cognitive clinic where people come in, we can see where their deficits are, and we can actually train to some of those deficits and hopefully improve them, help improve in those sort of deficits.
All right. Well, it's that. So, in order to have a cognitive clinic, utilizing some of your techniques, and funding, of course, is needed for something like that. Don't you have to prove its efficacy first?
Right. So, uh, yeah, and that's what we're working on.
Okay. All right. Sounds like a very torturous path on to try and help.
It is. And, and and there's so many other good cognitive approaches too. I mean, there's a lot of work that's being done on physical exercise, which I think that's very important for maintaining cognitive health as you get older. Because that which is good for the body is good for the brain. That's what I've been saying all these years, and I try to live by that too as well.
Okay, thanks. Yes, physical exercise appears to be helpful too.
Yeah. And so a lot of these approaches are also combining as well.
Right, right. Absolutely. It's all we have at this point.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I've been swimming in the cognitive cancer literature too, and there's not a lot there either. So we know some things are effective, but there's no unified way of pushing that forward as an agenda in those populations. And so that's a struggle, just not with HIV, but in other clinical populations too.
Right. And we just started the Senolytic study in the ACTG, and they'll be looking at cognitive function too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been very tough to get the cognitive outcomes in the ACTG studies. And that's not with, there's a lot of, even with the neurology or whatever the working group that we have, it's trying to convince leadership to integrate those into the studies. And it's not easy, as you know.
Yeah. Right.
Any other, I think though, the brace, David, we got it into a number of the BNAB studies. So that at least we'll see what happens there. Anybody else have any questions? Does anybody else want to unmute themselves? It's a quiet bunch today, David.
Well, they're so excited for the holidays.
Ah, yes. Awesome. But
Yeah.
David, I can't thank you enough for coming on here. It's great to see, how this study, I haven't seen this data yet, so it's pretty great. And yeah, so I think we do not have Caroline. Do you want to let us know? Because I forget what our holiday break is before we kind of
Sure.
ramp back up again.
Yep. So we are on a break until Wednesday, January 14th is when the spring series begins. And we'll have Kate Devlin from Drexel, and she's presenting Building Community Partnerships and Engaging with People Living with HIV and Community-Based Providers. So
Love it. So I hope everybody has an amazing holiday season with whatever you celebrate. And look forward to picking this back up in January. And we have a great lineup of speakers in the spring as well. So please keep coming, send your trainees, and we'll see you guys soon. Thanks, David.
thank you.
Bye, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.